Frank, can you put up the opening slide? Welcome and good morning. I'm really glad to have you all with us, and we'll get underway with our latest SGI educational webinar on wealth and pay disparity. Well, a couple of things around our methodology here. So you'll start as participants in listen-only mode until the Q&A section. You can enter questions as well into the chat. And after this, we're making the recording, as you can see, and the recording actually will be publicly available. I didn't amend this slide correctly, I guess. But moving on, our itinerary today, we'll have a little introduction with an opening reflection. We'll hear from Brandon Rees, we'll hear from Rosanna Landis Weaver, and we're going to take some questions and answers. So it's a pretty straightforward itinerary. If we can move to the next. Again, our companions then, Brandon Rees from the AFL-CIO. I'll give a little longer introduction of him in a few moments. And Rosanna Landis Weaver from As You Sow. One more, Frank. And we'll begin with a reflection by Sister Barbara Jennings, please.
Sister, you're on mute.
Okay. So in our Catholic social teaching, justice is considered under the topic of charity and love. And oftentimes I think we only think of love as charity, of giving to our food pantry or volunteering. But I think the work that we do, all of us at As You Sow and SGI and ICCR, etc., union organizing, whatever it is, it comes under justice. And all of the popes have said, and Jesus also said, blessed are those who provide justice for the poor, not just giving, but systemic change. And that's what we're about. So I invite you to respond to my little prayers with the words, may love and justice find a way through us. In a world fragmented and divided, may love and justice find a way to bring harmony and unity. In your response, may love and justice find a way through us. In a world of economic extremes, may love and justice find a way to level injustices. Our response, may love and justice find a way through us. In a world where some consume more than all they need, may love and justice find a way to waken us in our consciousness. May love and justice find a way through us. In a world of spiritual poverty and material surfeit, may love and justice find a way to open hearts to the enough of God. May love and justice find a way through us. In a world of small thinking and selfishness, may love and justice find a way to live with global intent. May love and justice find a way through us. In a world of suffering humanity and dwindling natural systems, may love and justice find a way to bring the fullness of life to all. May love and justice find a way through us. In a world where global dilemmas seem overwhelming, May love and justice find a way to take one step at a time. May love and justice find a way through us. Amen.
Thank you, Sister Barbara. That's really to the heart of who we aim to be, you know, catalysts for change for people and for planet. When we think about topics like pay and wealth disparity, one place we might begin is thinking about what good corporate governance is. You know, it's the G in ESG that allows for companies to better lean into the challenges and opportunities in their midst. A well-governed company can drive change rather than simply be subjected to it. And Warren Buffett, chairman and CEO of Berkshire Hathaway, famously described executive compensation as the acid test of corporate governance. For my part, I think the Oracle of Omaha may be only half right. Yes, executive compensation is critical, but it is only half the picture. The other half of the picture looks at the wages of the lowest paid in a company, in a supply chain, the most vulnerable. It's a matter of not only looking from the top down, but the bottom up. A couple of weeks ago, Tesla CEO Elon Musk made headlines as the first person in history with a net worth exceeding 300 billion. The other part of that story, by comparison, is that the median US worker would need more than 4 million years to match that amount. SGI has a long history in this space. From our founding in 1973, Father Mike Crosby has advocated for a living wage. SGI consistently advocates for increasing the federal minimum wage. In 2013, critical moment in many ways, President Obama at that time said, rising income equality is the defining challenge of our time. And at the same time, Pope Francis said, how can it be that it is not a news item when an elderly homeless person dies of exposure, but it is news when the stock market loses 2 points? As a consequence, one of Father Mike's final efforts was a campaign for pay equity in 2014 by filing shareholder resolutions with 12 retailers. The SEC allowed companies to omit the resolution based on micromanagement. So SGI members continue to challenge retailers and restaurants to pay living wages for their own workers and for those in their supply chain, in the hopes of building an economy that works for the many, not one that concentrates more and more wealth in the hands of the privileged few. We keep coming back to this issue to see if there are new ways that we can address income and wealth disparity. Last year, the Franciscan Sisters of Perpetual Adoration proposal on racial equity and starting pay at Walmart obtained a strong shareholder support for a first-time resolution. SGI members this year have joined ICCR's campaign to ask restaurants to raise their sub-minimum wage for tipped workers. Increasingly, economists have come to see that wealth and income disparity harm the economy. Rising concern for pay and wealth disparity and proxy voting and changes at the SEC lead us to think that the tide may be shifting. And so we come to today's conversation to be better informed and to renew our commitment to act. We are delighted to have with us two of ICCR's leading lights when it comes to questions around compensation, Brandon Rees and Rosanna Landis Weaver. Brandon is the Deputy Director of Corporations and Capital Markets for the AFL-CIO. As you likely know, the AFL-CIO is a federation of labor unions, and it represents 12.5 million working men and women. Brandon also serves as the Supervisory Committee Chair of the AFL-CIO Employees Federal Credit Union. He's a trustee on the AFL-CIO Staff Retirement Plan and is an advisory board member of Heartland Capital Strategies. He's previously served as the Shareholder Advocacy Committee co-chair of the Council of Institutional Investors and a member of the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board's Standing Advisory Group. And earlier in life, received a BA in economics and a JD from the University of Cal Berkeley. Brandon, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you to Seventh Generation for inviting me to speak with you today. The AFL-CIO, as you mentioned, is proud to be a associate member of ICCR. And of course, we've worked with many of your members on a variety of shareholder initiatives over the years. First, for some background about the AFL-CIO and my role in it, administering the Capital Stewardship Program. Working people are of course investors in public companies through their retirement savings. And we're also stakeholders of companies as employees. Globally, there is over $38 trillion in retirement savings in OECD countries. And it's our goal, our mission with the AFL-CIO's Capital Stewardship Program to promote sustainable business practices that are in line with the long-term investment horizons of our members' pension plans for providing for their retirement security. So that's the background and the philosophy that we bring to this work. And I want to talk to you today about the issue of income inequality, particularly as it relates to CEO pay and within the company. If we could go to the next slide, please. So the AFL-CIO since 1997 has published an executive pay watch website that's available at paywatch.org, in which we track CEO pay levels for S&P 500 and Russell 3000 companies. In 2020, last year, which is the most recent available information, the average CEO of an S&P 500 company received $15.5 million in total compensation. Compared to 2019, that's a pay increase of more than $700,000. And we need to remember what is the context for that pay increase. The United States and the world was going through the worst public health crisis in a century with the COVID-19 pandemic. Here in the United States, the unemployment rate reached 14.7%. That's the highest rate of unemployment, mass unemployment, that we've ever experienced since the Great Depression, with over 41 million working people laid off in this country. And how did CEOs react? Well, many announced that they were taking symbolic salary cuts as they were furloughing their workforces. And we saw a great retraction in employment, particularly by low-wage workers, the most vulnerable workers in our economy. But at the same time, they loaded up on stock-based compensation. And that stock-based pay dwarfed the symbolic CEO pay salary cuts that we saw in 2020. We also saw an increase in inequality within the company. S&P 500 CEO to worker pay ratios increased from 264 to 1 in 2019 to 299 to 1 in 2020. Next slide. So on our Executive Pay Watch website, we maintain an accessible database for users to be able to look up CEO pay at S&P 500 and Russell 3000 companies. We have here, you can see the highest paid CEOs from 2020, according to our PayWatch database. Some of the top 3 companies: Playtika, which is a video game company; Paycom is a payroll company; and One Life, which is a subscription-based medical care company. You can see the eye-popping levels of compensation that these executives received in just 1 year alone. Our pay numbers are based on the SEC's summary compensation total, as the SEC prescribes for companies to disclose. That's based on the grant date value of equity compensation, which makes up the bulk of CEO pay packages in this country. Why do investors care about CEO pay? One, you often hear, that CEO pay should be in line with company performance as measured by the stock price. But it's also important to realize that high levels of CEO pay itself is a risk factor. That the siren song of a life-changing CEO pay package can cloud or distort the views of CEOs to take shortcuts in order to meet their quarterly earnings expectations, or even worse, in its worst case, corporate malfeasance and accounting fraud, as we'd seen in the Enron and WorldCom scandals of the early 2000s. The other reason we should care about CEO pay is it's the primary driver of income inequalities. I'll get into later in my presentation. And how did we get this way? Well, the problem is that compensation committees of boards of directors have a fundamentally flawed process for setting the target amounts of CEO pay. The standard operating procedure for compensation committee is to select or have the compensation consultant select a peer group of other companies and then target their CEO's pay based on that peer group, which sounds attractive. But the problem is that many companies, or at least or some companies, may cherry pick their peer group to include larger, more successful companies where CEO pay is higher. The CEOs on this list, for example, will be showing up next year in other companies' peer groups that they select for benchmarking their pay. That cherry picking effect creates a Lake Wobegon effect where all CEOs are above average. Mathematically, the average is bound to rise if just one company selects larger or more successful companies where CEO pay is higher. So that's the problem with how companies are setting CEO pay. Next slide. So one solution we've been urging is for boards of directors to consider how they also compensate the rest of their workforce, as measured by the ratio of CEO to median employee pay. Folks may recall that the Dodd-Frank Act of 2010 required the SEC to issue regulations that for companies to start disclosing their median employees' pay and how it relates to their CEO pay. It took us over 5 years to get the SEC to issue that regulation, and we just started getting the disclosure in 2018. At the time, companies made all sorts of objections to providing this type of disclosure. Coming down to the issue of, they just didn't know how much they pay their median employee, or that it would be too difficult to measure how much they pay their median employee. That in itself is a concern, because that tells me that boards of directors were not paying any attention to how the company compensates its workforce. And its workforce, of course, is critical to creating value for the company, its shareholders, as well as its customers and the communities that it operates in. So this CEO to median worker pay ratio disclosure requirement opened a crack in the door to allow us as shareholders to see how the company pays its workforce. And that's the median employee pay data. And it's quite telling, even just having that metric. For example, the company with the highest pay ratio in our database, Abercrombie and Fitch, you can see how little compensation, less than $2,000 a year, their median, and by median, that means their middle employee, than half their workforce makes less than the disclosed amount. They do provide a supplemental disclosure to put that information into context, which is something that we encourage companies to do. They disclose their median associate is a part-time associate here in the United States who works on average 7 days a week and has only worked for the company for 6 months. So that tells you something about the amount of turnover that Abercrombie and Fitch experiences in its workforce. They also say in their defense of their pay ratio that they have a promote from within mentality. So I guess they have to churn through quite a few workers to find those employees that they want to promote from within. And one of the other objections we heard from the corporate community to this disclosure requirement is, well, how this information is impossible to quantify or too difficult to compare, and investors just won't know what to do with it. But the point we made is that it actually tells you quite a bit in understanding the human capital management practices of retailers. If you compare Abercrombie and Fitch to, for example, another retailer on this list, Restoration Hardware, you can see that Restoration Hardware's median employee compensation is over $30,000. And you might read into that perhaps they strive to have a workforce who maybe they're full-time employees, maybe they work the entire year. Perhaps when you go to one of their stores, their associates are better able to assist their customers. And more importantly, I think from a a social justice perspective, a company that provides wages that that provide jobs, better retail jobs than perhaps Abercrombie and Fitch does. The other reason we focus on pay ratios is that it tells you, it gives you an insight into the company's CEO pay philosophy. Are they paying the CEO in a manner that's consistent with their overall compensation philosophy for their workforce, or is it a winner-take-all system? Is this the CEO's pay? Is the CEO put into a bubble and only compared to other CEOs, or is their compensation as CEO based on a thoughtful approach as to what's best for our company? One point that we in the labor movement are very aware of is that high CEO to worker pay ratios hurt employee morale and productivity. When your CEO is making 500, 1,000, 3,000, 5,000 times the median employee's pay, that's a dispiriting message to the workforce. And I don't care if you're, the CFO or one of the next 5 highly paid executives of the company, or if you're the median employee on the shop floor or the retail floor, it sends a message as to your relative contribution to the workforce. And so that's why we urge companies to consider median to worker pay. Now I'll move through the next slides rather quickly, but this slide illustrates a problem in our US economy, which is the gap between productivity growth and worker pay. As you can see, before 1980, there was a strong alignment between worker pay and worker productivity growth. We've heard recently concerns about inflation coming and that workers' wages going up, or the fact that companies have had difficulty attracting workers at low levels of pay might lead to inflation. But if you talk to economists, economists are not concerned about wages increasing inflation unless it outstrips worker productivity. And here you see a great disconnect that started in 1980. For those students of history, you'll remember that was when Ronald Reagan, during the PATCO strike of air traffic controllers, fired the workforce and signaled a turn in U.S. labor law that the U.S. government would no longer seek to protect workers' rights, and that was the beginning of a long decline in worker power in this country, as symbolized by the decline of union density. Next slide. So here is a graph overlay of union density in the United States compared to inequality as measured by the percent of income that is received by the top 1% of earners in the country. And you can see that if you go back to the 1930s, when income inequality was very high, union density was very low. Then once we got into the 1930s, the passage of the Wagner Act, which is the basis of US labor law, enshrining the protection of the freedom of workers to form trade unions and to negotiate for fair wages, we saw a dramatic increase in union density and a corresponding decline in inequality from World War II to 1980. Then that trend reversed in 1980. We've seen a dramatic increase in inequality corresponding to a decline in workers' bargaining position inside the company. Next slide. Here again, you can see what that inequality looks like. This is looking at the income share of the top 0.1% compared to the bottom 90% of US earners in the United States. And you can see from the Gilded Age, right before the stock market crash in 1929, income inequality peaked. Then we had a dramatic decline in income inequality during the post-World War II economic boom, which we experienced broad-based prosperity. And then again in the 1980s, a dramatic increase in inequality. And what that reflects is labor's declining share of the economic pie. And so the question is, what can we as investors do? Next slide. to try to address these trends in our economy. So I've got three major topics. I know Rosanna is going to go into more detail about ideas for investors to hold both companies and our asset managers, who are the intermediaries of our savings, accountable. But the first is that, we can vote our proxies against runaway CEO pay. Companies now are required to have the annual advisory vote on executive compensation, as well as on golden parachutes, that the say on pay vote. And I would just say that one powerful thing that investors can do is to band together to organized vote no campaigns to send a message against runaway CEO pay. We can also vote against executive pay. These are the annual bonus plans and stock compensation plans if the company has a history of awarding excessive compensation. And we can vote against compensation committee directors. And in voting our proxies, I've been a strong advocate for including pay ratio disclosure information as part of that calculus. If a company's pay ratio is excessively high, our proxy voting guidelines call for a no vote on the executive compensation say on pay vote. We can also engage with companies on their human capital management practices. It's not just about limiting CEO pay, but we also want to lift up employee pay. We want to turn bad jobs into good jobs. And there are a variety of ways that we can do that through shareholder resolutions. For example, we have a shareholder resolution on asking companies to consider the ratio of CEO to median employee pay when setting CEO pay amounts. That's gone to a vote at Mondelez in recent years, if you're interested in looking at that. We also organize investors sign-on letters to express concern about the company's workforce practices. Are they, for example, right now we have a letter to Excelsior Luxottica, which is a international glasses company, that urging the company to respect its international obligations to respect for workers' rights here in the United States. And then finally, through dialogue and engagement with companies. And then finally, we need to be supporting the SEC's forthcoming workforce disclosure regulation that the SEC is planning to propose through a notice of proposed rulemaking in the near future. That if it's not disclosed, if it's not measured by companies, it can't be managed. And the idea is that by disclosing more information about the company's approach to its workforce, investors will be able to invest in companies that are creating good jobs with high productivity workplaces. And I've listed here the four key disclosure requirements that the Human Capital Management Coalition, which the AFL-CIO and many other investors participate in. That is employee composition, the breakdown of the workforce between full-time and part-time and contingent workers, the compensation of the workforce, the wages and benefits that the company offers that workforce, its retention and turnover rates. That is also an important indication of the quality of the jobs, and I believe an important factor for workforce productivity. For example, Amazon has reportedly experienced turnover of up to 150% in its warehouses. That means that they're having to hire their entire warehouse workforce every 6 months. And then finally, diversity, equity, and inclusion. What is the company's EEO1 breakdown? And then finally, I wouldn't be worth my salt if I didn't mention the need for labor law reform and passage of the Protecting the Right to Organize Act, the PRO Act, which is currently in Congress, and the role of trade unions and the freedom of workers to organize unions to lift up wages. Union workers make 11% more than their corresponding non-union counterparts, controlling for hours and skills and other demographic information. When we come together in a union, we're also able to negotiate for improved health care coverage, for paid sick leave policies, and for a secure retirement in the form of a defined benefit pension plan. And these are all benefits that the freedom to organize a trade union brings. So with that, I'll conclude and turn it over to my colleague, Rosanna.
Thank you, Brandon. You've given us a lot to chew on. We'll come back to some of this in questions. I hope people are taking down their questions. Passing it to Rosanna, who has been working in the governance and compensation field since 1992. She began her work in governance with a position in the corporate affairs office at the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, supervising research on corporate governance and management practices. She has spoken about compensation concerns in all kinds of settings. An investor, the Corporate Governance and Practicing Law Institute's Corporate Governance Institute, and an investor relations business conference on understanding and responding to shareholder activism, and even appeared on Your World with Neil Cavuto for those who are partakers of the news from his organization. She's also been a part of the Investor Responsibility Research Center in 1999 and served as an expert on labor shareholder activism. Also worked at Institutional Shareholder Services, ISS, where she worked on the executive compensation team as a senior analyst until 2010. And maybe just moving.
That's enough.
I can give more detail, but that takes away from the time that you've got to tell us about your work. So go ahead, Rosanna. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next slide. So I always like to start with this one because sometimes the topic is a little dry. And as it notes here, the kitten is only here to get your attention. I think most of us are familiar with these kind of statistics. And Brandon spoke on covered many of these. And I'm going to try to not repeat Brandon too much and go pretty quickly so we have time for questions. But again, the minimum wage should be a whole lot higher than it is. And next slide. And this actually shows that a lot of issues that we might not think about, or values that we might not even think about, really align very closely with income inequality. And you see how we have high income inequality and all of these wonderful things we want, from social mobility to positive trust within society. All of that goes down when you've got high income inequality. So it's again, that's part of the reason we care. Next slide. And again, looks very similar to what some of what Brandon has shown. This is we're taking an investor perspective here too, and showing how the S&P 500 is done, because you will often hear CEOs say, well, investors are happy. Some investors are happy, and certainly, people like bull markets. But what we've seen is that pay has gone up so much more sharply than the Wall Street, than the trading has. Next. So about 8 years ago, I was hired at As You Sow. And the question I was asked to come up with was to look at how people were using the say on pay vote. People, investors now have the possibility of voting on pay. There was a lot of confusion about how to sort of articulate a guideline that makes sense. There was a lot of temptation, I think, to just be, even among our very close allies who agree with us generally, to just be like, this is too complex. I'm fine. I'll do what management says, or at a minimum, I'll do what ISS says. And we wanted to prod that a little bit and look a little bit more closely at voting practices and guidelines. Next slide. So this shows you the opposition. And again, I encourage you, if you want to spend more time, many of you may have been on our webinar last year, and this year it's going to be February 25th, I believe. I encourage you to come again, and we'll have an updated slide. But this just generally shows some levels of opposition by, again, some of the largest financial managers. And you'll see that a lot of them vote against hardly any of the pay packages, including BlackRock. And actually, let me just make one quick note here, that something that has happened since last year's report. BlackRock has been being pushed by their clients and being asked, why do you only vote against these few CEO pay? And they have come out with more and more extravagant and polished reports, and they talk about their engagement, and they tell you that vote against the directors, but I think they also, I mean, they were feeling the pressure. And so what they have said is that now institutional investors can request different voting. So instead of just saying BlackRock will vote its policy, which again is abysmal. Even if you just go with a proxy advisory service, if you just go with Glass Lewis or ISS, they vote against many more pay packages than what BlackRock recommends. So that's very much worth something to consider if you use BlackRock, or if you have a fund that that uses BlackRock, to follow up on that question. Next slide. And this is just, again, just wanted to show this very briefly because it shows how much that the leadership is really coming from on the other side of the pond, as I say, that people in Europe are just incensed about high US CEO pay. They do not, I think they have a little bit more clarity in, why is this necessary? Does this really motivate people? What is really the point here? So they are much more likely to vote against very high levels. And again, sometimes up to 100%. Next slide. So one of the things that we do is look at guidelines. And I don't know if any of you are developing your guidelines or, thinking about guidelines. I always feel like, a certain level of limitation is a nice thing if you're imitating the right people. And also I think one of the reasons I talk about these things, probably not with you all, but with like some of our public funds and stuff, public pension funds, is because you get a little bit of cover if you see what others are doing. And just the Aviva investors here, bottom line, fairness and equality need to be more prominent principles in shaping the culture of CEO pay. Like that, if there's one sentence, shake away, that's it. They put it very perfectly. And here NEI Investments talks about why sort of the shareholder perspective is. I'm not going to read this now, but you can take a look at it later. And NEI Investments has a very they begin their guidelines with a lot of information on income inequality and why they care about that. Next slide. So again, Brandon mentioned most of this. The pay ratio was one little sentence in the massive Dodd-Frank Act, and there's multiple stories about how it got in there and whether other people knew it was there before they voted. But anyway, it got in there. One of the things I did want to add is that so companies fought this, and Brandon and I were both sort of around for this time. As he said, they're like, we cannot possibly begin to know what our median employee is paid. How can we know that? And they fought it very hard. It was too complex. Ultimately, the rule did give them some leeway, some choices about what to include and what not to include and how to make the calculations. And now what we're hearing them saying is, well, now, there's so many ways this can be done. You can't make an apples to apples comparison. And my response to that is you can't have it both ways. The corporate community was what was pushing for the disclosure that we got, the kind of disclosure we got. I think shareholders would have preferred more uniform, more comparable, but this is what they asked for, and they don't get to now complain about it. Also wanted to bring up that we've got now multiple years of data on this, and so I think anytime you're engaging in any kind of corporate engagement at all, it can be really helpful to go back and look at the pay ratio disclosure for the past couple of years, because it can tell you things. And again, this should be part of, I think, every engagement, and you can use it in lots of different ways. And one way is around, if you're talking about larger equality issues, you can, for example, use it as a framework and ask, what percentage of women employees are earning below the median here? What percentage, and so that becomes a very important component. Let's go ahead and go to the next one, because I think I have this on here. And you can, again, this is probably one you're going to want to look at maybe more later if you want to see how folks are doing it. But it's how some funds have talked about pay ratio. And there's one here, I think it's here, that talks about how one thing to really pay attention to is fixed compensation. So a lot of the pay is through equity, but a lot of the inflation goes up through salary. It's a very easy thing to benchmark, and it's gone up quite a bit. It also leads to another concern. When we try to establish a ceiling, corporations are very happy to make that the floor. And that is something of what happened under Section 162M. The salary had to be $1 million, but you could have performance-based pay above that. And all of a sudden, salaries went up to $1 million. It wasn't that salaries went down from higher than $1 million. So again, most CEOs now, a lot in the S&P 500 are paid more than $1 million. And now that 162M is gone, we're still seeing that. So I have real hesitation in identifying what we think is an appropriate ratio, and I'll get to that in a minute. But because it can, again, the ceiling can become the floor. North Star's been doing this, by the way, a long time. The U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. But anyway, I was going to get under GAM, it says particularly salary increases are not aligned with the rest of the workforce. That's a really easy one to tell. And again, now you have a couple years of data, and salary inflates CEO pay. It's an easy benchmarkable one. It's a one where bonus and other things are often said as X times salary. So, and it's probably what correlates most clearly with the median employee, right? So you can look year over year, for example, and some companies are saying this, but like, for example, I think it was Chipotle. So Chipotle, their median this year was 13,127. It was down from 2020. And this is, again, fewer hours and shifts is what they said it was. But again, if you can look at the median and come up with that really tells you that. And again, I'm just, Brandon talked about this, but I just don't think we can repeat too often how horrific these figures are. A median employee making $7,000, and that's, I think, was looking at the Gap. That means that half of them are making less than that. Or a median employee at Chipotle making $13,000 means that half are making less than that. And they will argue, oh, these are part-time jobs, blah, 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 college students, whatever. But, it's harder and harder with unpredictable schedules. And there's a lot of, Brandon probably has a lot more resources in this than I do. But it's really hard to put together a living by coupling a couple of part-time jobs. But imagine you had a part-time job at Chipotle and a part-time job at Gap and a part-time job at Abercrombie, and you still made $22,000 a year, right? It combined. It's ridiculous, and it's worth making sure. I think the word median. So again, next slide. Okay, so this is what is the right ratio, and I get back into this. Grafe Crystal was actually still a compensation consultant when I got started on this, and was appalled by what he saw. And again, so Plato told Aristotle, no one should make more than 5 times. J.B. Morgan said 20 times. Jesus advocated a negative differential, and that's why they killed him. That's my pinned tweet on Twitter, and I like to go back to it. So I'm hoping we have some time for questions and answers. I hope I didn't speak too fast, but I was just trying to rush right through that. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosanna. That was great. There's a lot for us to chew on here. And maybe I'll just start by saying, we'll make available, of course, the slides, the recording. We'll also put in a link so that you can get to paywatch.org. And we always send around Rosanna's webinar to our members, the link or the registration for that. So you'll be getting that in time for it. The other thing that if you're on Twitter, do follow Rosanna. She is to follow there. So maybe just kind of, we've talked about a handful of things in terms of what shareholders can do, questions to bring into dialogue, ways to think about proxy voting guidelines, actions that can be done, even some simpler things like sign-on letters we can be a part of, and maybe thinking about the resolution side a little bit, because that's one thing we've been involved in for quite some time, but we found some doors closed in previous years. But maybe we'll start with just the question. There was a new staff legal bulletin from the SEC. Might that open some doors to us now?
Absolutely. The door that was shut has now been reopened. And what is important to note with the SEC's staff legal bulletin from last week was that they explicitly recognized that workforce considerations can rise to a significant social policy level. So transcending ordinary business and are appropriate considerations for shareholders. So I expect the SEC will be taking a much more flexible and pro-investor approach, and it's no action letter decisions, so that issues of significant social policy issues such as does the company provide paid sick leave to its workforce during the COVID-19 pandemic, which we all saw as being so important to protecting public health, as well as to be frank, the health of the workforce, so that they can continue to do their jobs, will now be permitted under this new approach that is outlined in the staff legal bulletin. So we're all excited to see what different investors' ideas are, and I expect it's going to be quite an interesting proxy season next year.
Thanks, Brandon. Maybe you mentioned COVID, and kind of looking at the top again. How did the COVID pandemic affect CEO pay in 2020, 2021? And any guesses about if that will have any effect looking beyond?
Yeah. So and I'll let Rosanna, I'll let you dive in, but just quickly, I was just going to say that I was actually quite astounded to see CEO pay go up in 2020, because we had heard so many reports about companies cutting their CEOs' salaries as they furloughed their workforce, but in fact it went up, and it went up because of equity pay. And in fact, another flaw in the use of equity compensation for CEOs is it typically gets granted at the beginning of the year, which happened to coincide with the bottom of the stock market. People remember in 2020, there was a big decline in the stock market due to COVID-19 and the shutdown of the economy, which just happened to be coincidentally when many companies gave their CEO the equity awards, which are based at that then value, at that lower stock price. So in a way, executives profited from the volatility in the stock price as the market recovered. And it's hard to argue that the general recovery in stock prices had anything to do with any individual CEO's decision making. More generally, that's what's wrong with using stock price performance as your yardstick for measuring or awarding CEO pay. Is that they profit from the share prices go up, but no one is taking pay back from the executives when share prices go down. So it's a heads I win, tails you lose formula.
Right. And this is something we talk about too. I mean, we what shareholders vote on is what is disclosed in the proxy. And so that's what that it makes sense that this is the figure we're talking about. But especially in the bull market, I think it is vastly underestimated CEO pay. Some of the option selling trade-ins and so forth have been truly phenomenal. One thing that did happen this year, though, was more S&P 500 companies got majority votes against than in any year. There were companies that took actions that were really problematic, and for the most part, shareholders stood strong and voted against them. And I think that is a positive. Now, whether that's a trend or not, when I was going through, I did a blog post, by the way. Maybe I can make sure I have the link to this too, from which those quotes are lifted. But I looked at a lot of guidelines, and I think it was T. Rowe Price that specifically said, "Well, this year we're going to consider fairness." And I was like, "Well, so just this year?" Okay, I'm glad you're considering it this year. I'm hoping that the consideration of fairness will continue. And certainly seems to be, you know, a lot of shareholders are changing their guidelines, are improving their guidelines. The problem is when, as long as the big, hugest ones, you know, maintain their affinity with management, it's very hard to get the overall vote change. But this year we really did see some remarkable things. And I would also say, I mean, we continue to see the highest pay, the worst pay practices, and I don't know, Brendan, how this aligns with a couple of the ones you noted, but at companies where there is heavy insider control, where there's dual class stock or something. And one of the things that tells us is that there is a fear on some level, right? That shareholders do keep things from being as bad as they could be, even though they're very bad.
One of the things we noted was that companies where the CEO was in the 1,000 to 1 CEO to median worker pay club, those companies were more likely to have engaged in mass furloughs of their workforce during COVID-19. They treated their workforce as being disposable, and that is reflected in their pay ratios going into the pandemic. These are the 2019 pay ratios. What that means is those companies are now struggling to find workers to replace those jobs. So when you hear about the Great Resignation, or companies struggling to find workers, they should have, you know, considered the fact that perhaps if you lay off your workforce, they might move on to better jobs, better industries that will support their families. And so it really is, you know, a short-sighted approach to not invest in your workforce, not retain them when times are tough, because you may have difficulty getting them to come back once the economy is recovered.
And please jump in with questions. I see Frank's got one.
Yeah, let me just ask, because it was a little confusing in your presentation. Are you suggesting that asset owners include in their proxy guidelines a metric that directs them when to vote against the say on pay, a metric based on either the CEO to worker ratio or the CEO pay? You know, what guidance you did refer to some, Rosanna, some proxy guidelines, but generally, what do you suggest that asset owners include?
You know, I think it sort of depends on what sort of asset owner you are and how much you own and what your budget and your time limits are. This is, you know, the preference would probably be to do a case by case and very thorough, and read Glass Lewis's and read ISS's and da 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 da. But the reality is that everything happens at once, and I think it's a reasonable thing to look at pay ratio, especially if it's a socially invested fund. I mean, I think you can easily, and I have another blog, I don't know if you want to, that talks about companies that used to have pay ratios, like including Whole Foods, and, you know, used to have that within the company and maintained it and said we never had any problems keeping our employees, even though I think it was like 17 to 1 or something like that. I mean, it can be done. So, but again, the risk of setting a specific number, you know, does that become then an accepted number? So I don't think 100 to 1 is acceptable myself, right? Even though that's what we have in our guidelines, because we need to have something. And yeah.
Our proxy voting guidelines address pay ratios as a qualitative factor for consideration. We've always shied away from prescribing a specific or ideal pay ratio. Companies differ, industries differ, but we do think it is important, particularly for relative to other companies' approach to these issues. And you can also look at how the pay ratio changes over time as an indication of growing inequality within the company. and consider whether that's an appropriate thing to be going on, or does it send a dispiriting message to the rest of the workforce when the CEO is taking the lion's share of pay. A company at its heart is a collaboration. It's a collaboration of workers, of executives, of investors to provide goods and services for the company's customers and the communities that it serves. So when you treat CEO pay separately from that collaborative approach, I believe it's a recipe for long-term disaster, leading to CEOs taking excessively risky decisions that jeopardize value for all the company's stakeholders, employees and shareholders included.
Thanks, Brandon. We've spent a lot of time looking at especially the top, but when we think about looking from the bottom up again, as we said at the top of at the beginning of our time, that wealth and pay disparity have this kind of racial and gender components. Like in the global workforce since the onset of COVID-19, especially women and girls have faced serious setbacks globally. They also hold the key, I would think, to a more robust and inclusive growth in the months and years ahead. McKinsey put out a report that estimated that if we center recovery efforts on women, it would contribute 13 trillion to global GDP by 2030. We've seen a lot of overwhelming evidence around economic inequality, especially the gap between Black and white Americans and the threat that poses to corporations. A lot of companies after George Floyd put out statements recognizing the problems of racism and inequality. But we know that's not enough. How might the private sector play a leading role? Or would that be something that they could even show in their ratio, in their the ratio disclosures, as a kind of pointed thing there?
Well, and investors are already asking for companies to provide EEO-1 disclosure of the workforce's demographics by race and gender. And I'm very excited that the SEC in its proposed rulemaking on workforce disclosure is considering that requirement. And investors have been advocating for a breakdown of income by demographic groups so that shareholders can see the company's progress in diversity, equity, and inclusion. And one initiative that the AFL-CIO engaged in last year was urging financial services companies, which have a long history, of course, with redlining and other concerns around diversity and inclusion, to adopt the Rooney Rule for all employee hiring, meaning that when interviewing job candidates, they have a policy requiring the inclusion of diverse candidates in that slate of so that there's an equal opportunity, and hopefully will encourage the company to improve its outreach to tap all sectors of our economy for talent, not just looking at traditional sectors or an executive's personal connections. So that and I was very pleased with the response that we received. We ended up withdrawing all those shareholder proposals, and many financial services companies have adopted such policies, not just for their CEO, not just for their board of directors, but pushing it down within the workforce.
Thanks, Brandon. We've actually run through our 60 minutes here. It has flown by. I am exceptionally grateful that we had Brandon and Rosanna with us. We offer our thanks on behalf of all of us here at SGI. Also, thanks for those of you who joined us today. And you'll see in the slides as well contact information for Brandon and Rosanna. We can follow up with further questions. Also, some of the things they've referenced, we will put in the blog that will include all this information. And I'll also be sharing with you an evaluation. We'd really be grateful for your feedback on how we can continue to improve our webinars. So again, on behalf of SGI, thank you, Rosanna, Brandon, thank you all for being with us, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you for having us.